Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, last night we had the final stream ahead of Season 2 starting in Diablo 4 next week, and we got a fair bit of information from that, but immediately after the stream, the developers dropped the full, complete patch notes for 1.2, which is hitting simultaneously with the season start. To put it simply, there is an absolute butt-ton of things to go over here, so while I'm going to show all the information on screen, of course, the things that I talk about will mostly just be the highlights, meaning I won't really mention purely numerical changes that you can see on the screen unless they are particularly massive. Today we have a whopping 12 new uniques, 7 new legendary powers, 2 new paragon glyphs for each class, which is a total of 10 new ones, a ton of feature updates and base mechanical changes to the game, major shifts to how the game as a whole is balanced, and then also some pretty hefty class balancing changes on top of it all. So let's dive into it in the order that I imagine most people are most interested about, so starting off with the brand new stuff in the uniques and legendaries. And you should assume that all of these are usable by all the classes unless I specifically state otherwise. First, we have the Tacits of the Dawning Sky. When you take non-physical damage, you gain plus 6 to 10% maximum resistance to that damage type for 6 seconds, and only one type at a time. This fits in nicely to the new way that resistances work. We talked about that a ton in last night's video, so I won't be overloading you with it here, but these could find some use for sure. We have Tuskhelm of Yoritz the Mighty for Barbarians only. If you gain Berserking while already Berserk, you have a 40 to 60% chance to become more enraged, which gives you a 15% multiplicative damage increase, 2 Fury generated per second, and also 10% cooldown reduction. This one seems pretty damn strong to me, especially with reworks to some of these stats. This one could absolutely be used a lot. Then we have the Dolmen Stone for the Druid. I've commented on this one already. This just makes boulder casts while Hurricane is active to make your boulders rotate around you within the circle of orbit, rather than flinging out in a straight line, letting them do way more damage, especially in single target scenarios against unstoppable enemies. This will enable the boulder build for Druids, but that will be its only use. Scoundrel's Leather is another new one that we've already seen, specifically for the Rogue. When you proc the Inner Sight class specialization buff, your core skills have a 60 to 80% chance to spawn one of your traps, including Death Trap. Definite potential with this one. Blood Moon Breaches are new for Necromancer. Your minions have a 3 to 7% chance to apply a curse to enemies, and any enemy that is affected by at least one of your curses takes 70% increased overpower damage as a multiplier. Very high chance of use in the new game balancing, honestly, with overpower and minions both being notably stronger here than they were before. Blue Rose is the new Sorcerer unique. 30% lucky hit chance when damaging an enemy to form an exploding ice spike, dealing some flat cold damage, tripling the lucky hit chance if the enemy hit is frozen. This one seems quite cool for frostier builds, though flat number legendaries are hard to gauge in strength before actually seeing them active in game. Then we have some more generic uniques. Godslayer Crown. When you stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies, and you deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds. But this can only happen once every 12 seconds. This is definitely quite cool. It will likely see some sort of use on classes without consistent pulls like Druid potentially, but nothing earth-shattering here either. Flicker Step we saw in the stream. Each enemy you evade through reduces your active ultimate cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds up to 10 seconds. If you use this right, every dash charge can reduce ultimate cooldown by 10 seconds, which is actually quite a ridiculous amount, so I can definitely see any ultimate dependent builds getting a ton of use out of this one. Tibalt's Will are a bit familiar in a different way. While unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you deal 20 to 40% increased damage, as well as gaining 50 of your primary resource whenever you go unstoppable. Again, this will have some really strong applications, more than likely. X-Falls Corroded Signet, I don't know how to pronounce that, 50% lucky hit chance with damage over time effects to erupt, which causes an explosion to nearby enemies. Great for dot builds, but with flat damage. Again, I'd prefer to see it in game before giving it proper judgment. Soulbrand, your healing potion is no longer instant, instead granting a barrier for 200% of the healing that you would have gotten for 4 seconds. While you have a barrier, you gain 10 to 20% damage reduction. This actually has some really decent potential, specifically in combination with things like the Conceited aspect, which gives you more damage while you have a barrier active, and more specifically in combination with builds that have a lot of inbuilt healing already, and so potions can just be used a little bit more creatively. Then the final one, Banished Lord's Talisman. After spending 300 primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower, and your critical strikes that overpower deal 80 to 120% increased damage as a multiplier. This one will be pretty massive, I think. Overpower and crit mixed builds have a lot of potential in the new damage system, especially with the multiplicative bonus from this unique added in, so I can definitely see this one being a surprising new mainstay for a number of different builds in the game. Past that, we have legendaries, and yes, I know that was just the uniques. Aspect of Slaughter gives you 20% bonus movement speed, but you lose it for 2.5 to 5 seconds after you take damage. Just not good, honestly. There's just better sources of movement speed with less annoying downsides, and I would almost always rather have the bonus move speed in combat combat so I can get around and position myself properly, rather than only having it out of combat. Aspect of the Elements gives you 20 to 30% increased damage to a rotating set of damage types. This just completely is a little bit unmanageable and too low of a number to actually be worth it, unless you are getting both of these bonuses consistently activated by fighting with different elements, so it's just unlikely to see much use to me. Wanton Rupture for Barbarian specifically, your Rupture does not remove the bleeding damage from enemies. This can occur once every 30 to 40 seconds. Good effect, cool idea. Internal cooldown is way too long though. 30 to 40 seconds? I mean, come on. There are maybe 3 fights in the game that last that long currently, so only getting to use this once per fight is pretty sad, honestly. I'd rather it say once per enemy, and then you can at least continually use it going through packs of enemies and dungeons. Raw Might for Druids, after you hit 15 enemies with Werebear skills, your next Werebear skill will deal 30 to 50% more damage and stun for 2 seconds. It's not great. Druid just has better legendaries. It's not bad on its own, but there's just too many better options, but it could see niche use depending on how things shake out. Aspect of the Artful Initiative for Rogue, when you spend 100 energy, you release a cluster of stun grenades, and your grenade skills deal 15% more damage. We'll have to see how this translates into the new damage calculations, of course, but the devs have been pushing stun grenade concepts on Rogue for a while, so maybe there is eventually going to be something here that really works. It's sort of hard to say for now though. Aspect of the Long Shadow for Necromancer, lucky hit for shadow damage effects to generate 3 essence. Damage from Shadow Blight key passive always generates 2 essence. Good for shadow builds, but Necro hasn't really shown essence generation issues, so I'm not all that sure this is just necessary in the first place. And the final one here, we have the Battlecaster's Aspect, 30 to 40% lucky hit chance when conjuration skills hit an enemy, for Sorcerer of course, to gain +1 rank to all conjuration skills for 12 seconds, and this can stack up to 3 times. Conjuration Sorcerer will absolutely be a thing this season. They made a number of changes to ensure this will be a build that functions and shines. It may not be the quite top end of builds for Sorcerer, but it will definitely work very well in the new climate of the game. With that then, let's have a look at all of the new Paragon glyphs. I'm not going to read out the whole effect because it is on the screen and we just have so much info to get through, but we will talk about what they mean, what they'll do, and if it will get any use. For Barbarian, we have Twister. This affects your Dust Devil effects, which are things that are only created by various legendaries. This definitely boosts any build concepts that were considering using Dust Devils, but they weren't really in use before, so it doesn't really impact anything that was already existing. The saving grace here might be the additional effect that makes all of your damage get increased after creating a Dust Devil. After that is Rumble. This is for Earthquakes, which again are created by legendary effects. Leapquake as a build was already a genuinely usable, functional thing in previous patches, not anywhere near the top end of Whirlwind or Hammer of the Ancients, but buffs to Earthquakes will see that build rise up. Again, we'll sort of have to see how this functions in game because of the flat damage that it's increasing, but Leapquake might well burst its way up near the top end with this. For Druid, then we have Electrocution. Bonus damage to lightning bolts and dancing bolts, and enemies hit by either of them take 20% increased damage for 5 seconds. This is big for lightning builds. They will all be using this pretty much and will be very happy with the results. Tectonic is Earth skill crit damage, which is sadly just alright now that crit damage is additive rather than a multiplier, but the additional bonus lucky hit chance does have some interesting applications. Definitely not a strong glyph, but an interesting one with some niche usage potential. For Necromancer, we have Exhumation. This one feels really solid to me. Bonus corpse skill damage is great considering corpse explosion being such a big deal already, and Fortify and damage reduction is just a nice bonus on top of that. Desecration seems okay, but a little bit niche. Its proper effect requires you to stand inside of desecrated ground, and there isn't really a single good build in the game that relies on standing still inside of something for longer than a couple of moments at a time. Rogue gets Explosive, a big boost to stun grenade damage, and this is why I think stun grenades could become a thing, but who knows how this math will actually calculate out. Stun grenades could be amazing, they could be trash. It's hard to say until we put it all together in game. And there's also the Night Stalker glyph for shadow damage increases, and an interesting synergy between stealth and shadow imbuement. This could well see some usage given how common shadow imbuement is, and I don't think it's particularly hard to work concealment into a Twisting Blades build either, so this could actually be quite strong given the right setup around it. And then we of course have Sorcerer with Stalagmite, increasing the damage of ice spikes, again messing with the flat damage legendaries. This one is hard to judge out of the game, but then we have Invocation, which gives conjuration skills bonus crit damage, and also makes enemies hit by conjuration skills deal less damage, and considering Sorcerer has some survivability issues, this might be a nice combo glyph, and definitely will see use in those conjuration focus builds that I mentioned earlier. Okay, that's all the brand new items and the glyphs being added into the game, so now let's dive into the absolute mountain of class changes to existing stuff, because I know you all care about your classes quite a bit. Again, there's just a ton of info here, so I will be showing it all on the screen, but only actively pointing out what I believe to be the proper highlights of each section. Barbarian has a bunch of active skill changes to begin with, the biggest changes being to Upheaval, getting a nice buff, Rupture, getting some interesting enhancement changes, and Supreme Wrath of the Berserker now having a cap on its damage increase. As for passive skills, they are all just numerical changes, changes, all buffs on each one that has been changed. For your paragon board, there have been quite a few changes for Barbarian, and quite a lot of them are meaningful, so we'll talk a bit more about them. Decimator has been changed, and now when you make an enemy vulnerable, it gives you 10% increased damage for 5 seconds, and overpowering a vulnerable enemy will double that bonus. Bonebreaker is now every 12 seconds your next skill overpowers. Weapon Master is now swapping weapons, grants you 4% of your maximum fury. Hemorrhage is now bleeding damage, increased by 15% of the total amount of your damage to vulnerable enemies stat bonus in your actual stats that you can look at. Blood Rage now has the bonus function of also increasing your damage dealt in general by 25% of your damage while berserking bonus. The rest are just numerical shifts. A lot of big moves to the Paragon board here though. This will definitely shake some stuff up and could change how Barbs look at Paragon. As for legendaries and uniques, the aspect of Ancestral Force got fixed so it no longer has the weird double shockwave effect, but it also got a nice damage bump too. It will do less damage than what you were doing with the bugged interaction before, but more damage than it did without abusing the bug. Earthstriker's aspect has had its weapon swap number reduced to 8, and the overpower now only happens on non-basic skills, so it doesn't feel wasted. Then for uniques, we had a ton of specific stats being changed out for other stats. Those are on screen too, so I won't just read it out unnecessarily, and there were a lot of numerical shifts too on top of that. Other than that, Ancient's Oath had the only real effect change here with the slow after steel grasp replaced with a damage bonus after steel grasp, which is much more functional in the eyes of most players and will definitely improve the usability of this. Aside from that, Hellhammer also now has ranks of upheaval, which is really good to add to that, so an upheaval build will be in a much better place within this patch too. As well, 100,000 steps had a bit of a rework on the timer for the free ground stomp. Not quite sure that will make it good enough though. The timer was always the sore spot on this unique, so having it changed is a good idea. I just don't think it's been changed enough. Another nice change here is for Gore's Grips. Non-physical damage replaced with damage, so it actually just affects Whirlwind in general, and attack speed replaced with crit chance against close. Whirlwind has never been affected by attack speed in this game, so having attack speed on those gloves was just sort of dumb before, so now we don't. And that's it for Barbarian really. Overall, a lot of positives, some sort of mediocre bits, but nothing outwardly negative in my mind. Moving on then, let's talk about Druid. A lot of these notes here for Druid are just announcing the change of Fortified Generation being based on maximum life instead of base life like they used to be, but otherwise for the active skills, they're mostly just numerical shifts. A lot of notes, not a lot of excitement. For passives, it is a lot more of the same with a couple exceptions. The specific number changes on Charged Atmosphere and Electric Shock are pretty nice for lightning builds, and Nature's Fury, now specifying that the free skill that procs count as both Earth and Storm, could open up some really interesting cans of worms as far as legendary combos. This could really lead somewhere silly, honestly. As far as Paragon changes for Druid, it's mostly just some shifts to try and fit in with the new math in the game, making Earth and Devastation and Thunderstruck have their damage bonuses based off of secondary stats to try and incentivize you to use things that fit with the builds anyways. Nothing bad, nothing great, it's just there. Our only legendary specific change was Rampaging Werebeast gaining a cap on the crit damage, so sadly no more crazy Grizzly Rage infinite crit stacking builds, but hopefully this means that we can get a lot more interesting other builds now that they don't have to worry about balancing around an infinite crit stacker. As for uniques, this is where Druid gets some W's in for sure. A lot of it is just changing specific stats on different uniques, but they're taking out really bad stats and putting in genuinely useful ones instead, and it makes a lot of the middling Druid uniques that you didn't necessarily want over a random defensive legendary, even in the correct build, now actually be quite competitive, and I'm a big fan of that. I mean, hey, Hunter's Zenith is now a reasonably strong item, boosting 2 different passives that affect the build that it wants to be used in, so there's actually a lot of interesting stuff going on here for sure. Then let's move on to Necromancer, and there are a lot of words in this section, so I'll try and condense it down for you as much as I can. All of the minion-based Thorns affixes have been condensed down into a single gear affix that does all 3, and a new one has been added for minions to inherit your critical chance. Cooldown reduction can appear on shields now, as well as armor, and blood orbs now also heal your minions as a baseline of the mechanic now. Not many changes to your active skills, Prime Army of the Dead with a pretty decent corpse spawn buff, everything else is Fortify buff across the board, and a slight change to Dreadful Bone Prison. For passives, Death Defense Old Effect is now actually baseline for all summons of the game, so the new effect is minions gain armor and all element resist per rank of this passive. Terror now specifically applies to any shadow damage, not just Darkness skills specifically. Standalone had some changes to the wording. We had more Fortify change announcements of course as well, and then Rathma's Vigor got a full change. Now it's after being healthy for 12 seconds, your next blood skill will overpower, and the timer is reduced by 2 seconds each time that blood orbs heal or overheal you for an amount greater than or equal to your base life, which is a bit confusing, but I assume what that actually means is if you collect a certain amount of blood orbs, the timer will go down for this. Simple as that, which seems pretty nice. Shadow Blight had some changes as well. Now every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage while affected by Shadow Blight, they take bonus shadow damage, and the damage of Shadow Blight itself is increased by your shadow damage over time stat now just as a whole. Transfusion had a change too. Lucky Hit up to 9% chance allows for blood skills to spawn a blood orb. 4-second internal cooldown, spawn chance doubled against bosses. Gruesome Mending is now just more healing from all sources, and then just some numerical changes, but yes, that is in fact a nerf to Bone Spear builds that you see there, sorry to say. Then, not even into a new section really, we have the Book of the Dead for Necromancer with some changes too. Most of them are just numerical changes for minions and their damage, but here you can see them all if you want, with the biggest changes being Skeletal Warrior Defender Sacrifice is now plus 20% resistance to all elements, and Bone Mage Sacrifice being reduced from a 40% overpowered damage bonus to 25%. With that, let's talk about Necro Paragon changes, and holy crap, did you get a lot of them. To sort of summarize this mess of words just a bit, any glyph or node that specified only one type of minion now will just affect all of your minions as a whole, or at least a less specific group, and most of the statistical numbers on these effects have also been increased. On top of that, the majority of minion affecting nodes as well have just been boosted on your Paragon board in one way or another. The Corporeal glyph changed the effect to just boost magic nodes in the radius. Bloodbath has been changed to all overpowered attacks deal 35% more damage. Overall, this is a nerf to this a little bit, but with overpower being so much stronger this patch, it should be totally fine. And then just some scaling changes for a few glyphs and nodes too. Then, because just like being in service to a Necromancer, this section is never ending, we also have legendary and unique changes. For legendaries, Hulking Aspect has completely changed the slots it will appear on. Aspect of Hardened Bones no longer has a minion requirement. Aspect of Potent Blood now makes blood orbs give essence when at 80% health or above rather than only being at full health, and the rest here are just numerical things mostly, or shifts to match how Necromancer works now. As for uniques, we have a lot of just swapping out one stat for another, but there are some interesting changes here too. Deathless Visage had its flat damage bonus reduced, but gained a way to increase its damage from your own crit damage stat. Bloodless Scream now also makes darkness skills deal bonus damage to frozen enemies, as well as increasing the chill amount of darkness skills so that you can achieve that. Ring of Mendel no longer requires 7 or more active minions, and that just feels like it's interestingly trying to incentivize like a half minion build where you just use mages and a golem or something, but I guess the idea, regardless of specific builds, is to just give you more freedom to try things like that. That does it for Necro then, so let's move on to the Rogue. For your active skills, these are mostly just buffs to basic skills to try and make them more in line with Puncture as far as player use, and then just otherwise some numerical changes to a couple of abilities. For passives, Impetus now specifies non-basic skill, so the damage bonus is definitely much more useful. Victimized damage is now increased by 120% of your damage versus vulnerable bonus, and close quarters combat now just sort of has its changed wording so that while both damage bonuses are active, your total damage is increased by a percentage of your damage versus crowd-controlled enemies stat, rather than you just dealing more damage to crowd-controlled enemies. The big reason that this matters though is stuff like bosses, because now activating this bonus gives you bonus damage that will affect bosses, which it simply wouldn't in the previous wording unless they were fully staggered. As for Paragon changes then, the Eldritch Bounty legendary has changed to increasing your maximum resistance rather than base resistance value. Pride has changed its main effect to just boost all rare nodes in the radius, and No Witnesses has changed to gain an additional 10% damage from your damage with ultimate skill bonus stat, and also grant this effect to any skills for 8 seconds after you use your ultimate. For legendary specifically, Rogue basically just had a ton of numerical changes, mostly on the flat damage effects with the exception of Bursting Venom, which no longer only functions on critical strike, a pretty big change for that aspect. For uniques, again, a lot of this is just cleaning up which affixes are on which items to make them a bit more functional as a whole. Sky Hunter, now when activating the effect with max stacks of precision, also grants bonus critical damage on core skill cast as well as energy. The energy is less than before, but the damage is solid, and it lost the cap of only activating once per cast, which is also really nice. Eaglehorn, instead of making enemies vulnerable when hit from behind with penetrating shot, now makes enemies vulnerable either with your next cast after you've hit 5 enemies with penetrating shot. Much more reliable, really, and that pretty much does it for Rogue, so let's move on to our last class then, which is Sorcerer. For active skills, Glinting Firebolt now no longer has a critical requirement to actually activate the effect, which helps a lot for a dot focus build. Incinerate has a lower ramp up time. Enhanced Frozen Orb is better single target, Meteor is just bigger, and there's some crackling energy changes as well. For passives for Sorcerer, Potent Warding now also increases your maximum resistance, which is quite nice. Align the Elements now also persists for 2 seconds after taking damage, and that may have seemed a bit light, but now let's talk about the Paragon changes, which is where Sorc got the bulk of its time spent. Enchanter now increases maximum resistances instead of just base resistances. Galvanic Catalyst is changed from only buffing crackling energy to buffing all sources of lightning damage. Winter changed effects to simply boost rare nodes within the radius. Searing Heat was made far less awkward, now just straight up fire skills have 10% increased crit chance and direct damage increased by 10% on your fire skills of your bonus fire skill damage with a maximum cap. Burning Instinct now makes burn damage do bonus damage related to your crit damage bonus stat, and also bonus based on your intelligence stat too. Static Surge has changed from from a mana refund on stun to instead be, after spending 100 mana, chain lightning or charged bolts make enemies vulnerable and grant you 10% of your maximum mana, with the mana cost of this being reduced by mana cost reductions. Elemental Summoner now makes conjuration skills have reduced cooldown or mana cost, as well as getting a damage bonus based on your combined bonus damage with cold, fire, and lightning. Frigid Fate now increases damage to vulnerable enemies related to your bonus damage with cold stat, with a maximum, of course, and Icefall now makes frost skills deal 15% bonus crit damage to vulnerable enemies, doubled against frozen ones. Only a couple of legendary aspect changes after that then. Piercing Static, which used to be called Static Cling, now makes Charge Bolt pierce but deal less damage to any target after the first. That might feel a little bit familiar, but we'll talk about why in a moment. And Engulfing Flames now increases burn damage to enemies below half health, with bonuses if you apply enough burn to a single enemy. Then we have a just giant host of unique changes. Again, a lot of them are just moving one stat to become another, or giving them larger bonuses on the affix, but the main ones here are the Staff of Endless Rage, now also boosts the damage of every third fireball cast. Staff of Lam Essen now has the old Static Cling legendary aspect effect, so basically they just changed these two effects around and rebalance them a bit. Gloves of the Illuminator had its damage penalty reduced, which is good, as Adora's Overflowing Cameo had a number of mathematical changes, but also now scales damage with your intelligence stat, and the Oculus replaced Lucky Hit Chance to restore resource with a whopping all damage at 315% of that stat's normal value, really trying to make that unique a little bit more worth it then. So with that then, we have now talked about all of the new uniques, the legendaries, the paragon glyphs, all of the individual class changes as well, so let's just wind this down by taking a leisurely stroll through the overarching changes to the game coming in patch 1.2. A number of these things we have been told about in the streams leading up to this point, so if I gloss over something that seems a bit important, that would be why. As far as gameplay updates, some major things are stash filtering now and searching, which is very nice. An auto run being added is also convenient to have as an option too. For items, we've had a pretty major overhaul on enchantment costs. Here we have some examples, and it looks like the overall cost of enchanting is going down quite a bit, letting us actually do some rerolls without instantly bankrupting ourselves, so that's really nice to see. Gems are now crafting materials instead of taking up inventory slots. We knew about this one, but it's still a pretty big deal. The maximum item power in-game has gone up to 925 in this patch, but the actual rollable ranges on 925 gear for your affixes are still the same as the old 820s. It just helps to organize the system a little bit better with the changes they're making, so while we are getting higher number item power, the actual power should be similar, with the exception of flat numbers like armor values, weapon damage, and certain flat damage legendaries that should continue to scale with the item power number itself. The new examples here then are that Sacred now goes up to 750, Ancestral now goes up to 925. Monsters you kill will have a range of item power they are capable of dropping. That range seems to be about 75 from the lowest to the highest in most cases, except for as you dive into the proper endgame, the really high numbers where they let you spring up to 925 at a maximum, by going against higher and higher level enemies. What this means for stat breakpoints, we don't really know yet, but things are definitely changing as far as gear goes. We also have a pretty major thing that was already talked about by the developers, but from this point forward, in World Tier 3, you won't have loot drop that is lower quality than a Sacred Rare. Everything lower than that will instead instantly turn into crafting materials going right into your inventory to just avoid clogging up your main slots, as the same applies for World Tier 4 and anything lower quality than an Ancestral Rare in that tier. As a result, they are also notably increasing gold drop rates as they realize that half of what those items were previously used for was being sold for gold, so hopefully this is enough to compensate for that. Past that, we have a number of dungeon changes. Teleporting to a dungeon will now put you directly inside of it. Nightmare Sigils will be rewarded for finishing a Nightmare dungeon rather than just on boss kills, so it works for all dungeons, and then just a bunch of affix changes, most of which we already knew about. Nothing completely game-changing here though. Glyph experience at the end of a Nightmare dungeon has increased by around 19%, which is not bad in the slightest, and many dungeons have received visual and layout changes to try and reduce backtracking. Also worth mentioning while we're here that Adam Fletcher separately released the list of dungeons in the Nightmare Dungeon rotation for Season 2, which you can look at here. It looks like a nice healthy collection, some familiar names for sure, but not too many well-known hotspots either. It's a pretty good mix. Moving on then, we have endgame activities starting with Legion events. We knew about most of these changes, but Legion event experience reward increased by 75% is pretty major, given these were actually really good XP before anyways. World boss changes we were told about beforehand, except that world boss reward quality has apparently been significantly increased. We'll have to see what that actually means though once it applies to the game. Sigils from Whisper caches will be much more relevant, and Whisper caches will reward significant gold now, which hopefully is actually properly significant what they mean. As for mounts, these are all changes that we've known about for a bit. Better general movement, better sprinting and dashing, lower cooldowns, it's all really good stuff. Towns have had some adjustments, with major towns all having a bunch of bonus stash locations near the major vendors, and the Purveyor of Curiosities also being more centrally located towards the waypoint. And all small towns now have a stash 2 within them for convenience. As well, bonus waypoints will be unlocked when skipping the campaign. Monster stats as a whole have been rebalanced to match the way that players are being rebalanced too quite heavily in this patch. Level scaling is going back to the way with monsters that it was before, just having them match your level within certain brackets depending on your world tier. Aside from that, it's just a nice number of changes to individual monsters with specifically annoying abilities or interactions. Then we have some experience updates, incense now granting bonuses and lasting through death, a number of experience bonuses that were previously additive are now multiplicative, which is great, and most importantly the baseline experience for killing monsters has gone up dramatically at higher levels. No change from level 1 to 50, about a 15% increase for a level 55 monster from what it was before, and about a 55 to 60% increase at level 70 and also level 90, which presumably means that it will be about the same throughout World Tier 4. That is a pretty major increase if that's the case. No speed up level 1 to 50, which is fair, that wasn't really needed, but 15% faster through World Tier 3 is nice, and 60% faster through World Tier 4 sounds absolutely lovely if it actually plays out that way. As well, the experience rewards from Helltide Chest have gone up extremely dramatically too, 375% increase in World Tier 3, 750% increase in World Tier 4. There's also an increase to Whispers of the Dead experience, but this seems to mostly apply to World Tier 1 and 2, presumably just to help people have a more direct goal in the early game for leveling speed. And with that, we have our last notable section, the generic all-class affecting balance updates. Starting off, we have some generic uniques getting changed, and these are mostly like the class uniques, just changing which affixes that they have or the power of those individual affixes, with the exception of Mother's Embrace, who had its refund requirement reduced from 5 enemies to 4 enemies hit. Past that, we have our whole resistance changes really just shown in numbers. We talked a lot about this system in the stream roundup video that we released last night, so I won't be going through all the details, but the important new notes that we get here are that in World Tier 4 you will have minus 50% to all resistances baseline, that's the penalty for the World Tier, but also fully upgraded ancestral rings, and the same as an amulet, is equal to about 44% all element resistances, and a couple of bonus 10% to individual elements. So basically the baseline of your jewelry should pretty evenly scale with the penalty of the World Tier, meaning we likely will need to consider element resistances in our build in some way, but it shouldn't completely trash us if we don't. As well, because armor no longer grants resistances, they have buffed some armor generation methods such as Disobedience aspect, now maxing out at 66% bonus armor, which is crazy. And they've also buffed the total armor percent gear affixes as well. Then we dive into our biggest change of the whole patch and season, the updates to damage buckets. Again, we discussed this a lot in the previous video, but in summary, the way the game works now is just not functional. It's not a good base to build upon. Crit and vulnerable are way too powerful, and when stacked together, they can multiply to create higher numbers than anything else, and as a result, no builds that don't focus on crit and vulnerable aren't any good. So now what they are doing is changing the gear stats that boost crit damage and the ones that boost vulnerable damage so that those stats are additive instead of adding on to the multipliers themselves like they did before. If you get a crit, it will get bonus damage from your crit damage bonus stat added onto the flat damage, then it will be multiplied by 1.5 because it's a crit, rather than before where the whole number was multiplied by 1.5 plus your crit damage stat, which was what caused the insanity. The main result of this, in theory, is that it will take these stats and make them a bit less required to make good builds, and it will absolutely bring overpower back into the fold as a meaningful way to chase higher damage numbers too. Oh, and there were like a million bug fixes. I skimmed them, and the most meaningful one that I found is that Earthen Bulwark Druid has officially been fixed, with the skill now scaling off of weapon damage as it probably should always have. And that just about covers it then. I tried to get through this absolutely massive, mammoth patch note release as concisely and quickly as I possibly could while still giving the appropriate amount of time to the major sections and the major changes. I hope this helped you out if you didn't want to read the whole thing, or if I was just able to make something make a little bit more sense with my words that maybe didn't make sense to you when it was just written down in the first place. How does this affect your stance towards Season 2 for Diablo 4, if at all? Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.